Hi, I'm Nancy Harrington. It's August 25th, 2011, and I'm conducting an interview with Alan Ball on behalf of the Archive of American Television in West Hollywood, California. Okay, so we just want to start by getting a little bit of background information.
Okay.
What was your name at birth?
Alan Irwin Ball. Middle name Irwin, spelled with an E, and it was a family name. It was my mother's grandfather's name, last name.
And when and where were you born?
I was born in Atlanta, Georgia, at Emory Hospital on May 13th, 1957.
And where did you grow up?
In Marietta, Georgia, which is a suburb of Atlanta. I was there until I went off to college.
And what was your father's name and what did he do?
My father's name was Frank Ball, and he was a quality control person at Lockheed Aircraft. So he was an inspector of aircraft as they were, built on the assembly line.
And what was your mother's name and what did she do?
My mother's name was Mary Beecham Ball, and she was a homemaker, although she went to work when I was in junior high school. She worked at a fabric store, the fabric store is the one I remember the most. She sewed, so she had a little bit of practical experience going into that.
And what traits did you inherit from your parents?
I think I inherited a sort of dry sense of humor from my mom, a kind of maybe salt of the earth quality. My partner calls me a mule. I think I inherited that from my mom's side of the family. From my dad, I think I inherited a nasty perfectionist trait and a sort of introverted nature,
And did you have siblings?
I did. I had two older brothers. I have two older brothers. My brother Clark, who is almost 19 years older than me, and my brother Buddy. His real name is Arthur. And he's 15 years older than me. And then I had a sister who was 8 years older than me, but she died when I was 13.
And what were your interests growing up?
Growing up, I had a very active imagination. I very clearly remember the first movie I went to see, going to the movies, watching movies on TV. Even as a kid, I was thinking up stories and, putting on puppet shows and getting the kids in the neighborhood to put on these shows for our parents. I also... I think I had a very active imagination. I read a lot. I wasn't into sports. I wasn't very good at it. It just, a lot of the times the kids in the neighborhood, we would play, I would sort of direct them and sort of our, whatever we were pretending to be. It's not that interesting.
You said you remember your first movie. What was it?
It was called My Six Loves, and it starred Debbie Reynolds as a very famous Hollywood actress who somehow ended up being the adoptive mother to 6 adorable Ozark children. And over the course of the movie, of course, this was the very early 60s, she realized that she didn't want to be an actress at all. She just wanted to be a mother. So I think she married John Gavin, and then they were, kind of like the Brady Bunch. And then I remember going to see Pinocchio at the Fox Theater in Atlanta, which is one of those great old 1920s movie palaces. They still showed movies at that point. I remember I very clearly remember Swiss Family Robinson, the Disney movie, seeing it there. Yeah.
At that time, what did you want to be when you grew up?
I didn't really even think about what I wanted to be when I grew up. I don't really remember even thinking about that until I was in junior high school, and I wanted to be an architect. I wanted to be a composer for film scores. I wanted to be a high school band director. I wanted to be a journalist. By the time I got to college, I wanted to be an actor. And but really young, I don't really think I thought about what I wanted to be when I grew up. Just didn't. It seemed so far away.
Did you watch a lot of television?
I watched a fair amount of TV. I watched movies. I watched movies on TV, and I remember Lost in Space. I remember Mission Impossible. I loved Mission Impossible. In high school, before I got a car, I would watch the CBS Saturday Night lineup with Mary Tyler Moore and Bob Newhart and the Carol Burnett Show. Once I got a car, I kind of stopped watching television. And then, I guess during the 70s and 80s, I watched Dynasty with friends. We would get together on Wednesday nights and we would drink and scream at the TV because, it was so campy. I liked Knots Landing. I watched a lot of Cheers and reruns when I was living in New York. But once I got a car and had that freedom, I didn't watch that much television,
And then where did you go to college?
I went to Florida State University. I spent 1 quarter at the University of Georgia, and then my dad got really sick. 2 quarters at Georgia, and my dad got sick. And I came home and I went to the junior college, the community college, Kennesaw Community College for 1 quarter, and then I went to Florida State University in Tallahassee.
And what did you study there?
I studied theater. I wanted to be an actor. Eventually, I was pursuing, and I never graduated, I was pursuing a BFA with a double discipline in acting and playwriting, even though there was no playwriting instructor or classes. But what they allowed us to do was some friends of mine and I, one of whom is no longer with us, but the other one is Nancy Oliver, who wrote Lars and the Real Girl and who worked with me on 6 Feet Under and True Blood. We would do these shows in the basement and we would write these shows, and they started out as sketch comedy shows because that was right when Saturday Night Live was new, and then they became gradually a little bit longer, turned into one acts, full lengths, and after I was done with Tallahassee, I did a late night sketch comedy review that was very successful for a year. Successful in the terms that a lot of people came, nobody made any money. And then I moved to Sarasota, Florida, where Nancy was working at the Oslo State Theater, and we had a theater company there. And then years later, after I wrote a full-length play that did well in Sarasota, I moved to New York City. And a lot of friends of mine and I, who I had known from college, we started a theater company there, and I was there until I came out here.
So tell us a little bit about being in the theater scene in New York. How were you involved with it?
Well, I was a writer, I was a performer, I was a director. It was really a labor of love. Everybody had a day job. Nobody made any money. So I spent a lot of time, I think, really doing it just for the sheer love of it. And I think that was really, really healthy because I still have a relationship to my work that is not about, not purely about how successful something is. Is it a hit or is it a flop? Is it, is the box office big or little? What do critics think? I still have a relationship to the work that I do that was really sort of cemented over those years, where it's just really something that I really love to do. You know what I mean? And I came out here to work in sitcoms, and I spent 3 years in what for me were not very pleasant work environments due to a variety of reasons, and I think part of what fueled me to write American Beauty was a sense of I needed to get my passion about my work back. It's no accident that movie is about a guy who is a writer, granted a technical writer for a trade magazine, but he's lost his passion for life and somehow he gets it back. And I think the same thing happened to me in the process of writing that. I just felt like I had to write something that I cared about because I really didn't care about the shows I was working on.
So we'll talk about all that a little bit more, but when you were in New York, how did you support yourself?
I was a graphic designer in the art department of Adweek magazine. I designed what people call infographics, which is taking statistics and putting them, like if it's like corn, the rate of corn production, you would have stalks of corn going up a graph and stuff like that. And I worked there for several years. I was also a freelance art director for a magazine called Inside PR, which I don't know if that even exists anymore.
And how did your playwriting in New York lead to your first TV gig?
I wrote a play called Five Women Wearing the Same Dress that was produced off-Broadway by Manhattan Class Company. And the script found its way into the hands of David Tochterman, who at the time was a talent scout for Carsey Warner TV. And my agent called me out of the blue and said, "You've been offered this job writing for Grace Under Fire." And I said, "What is Grace Under Fire?" And he said, "It's a sitcom." And I was really, hoping that the playwright, I wanted to be a playwright, and I was hoping the playwriting, I was hoping that play would move to an open-ended run and would lead to a movie and all this stuff. And I wasn't expecting the TV thing at all, but when it became clear that the play was not going to move, and I looked around, and my friends that I worked with in the theater company, it had become a hobby for everybody because everybody's day jobs had turned into careers and people were having children and things like that. It had become a hobby, and there's nothing wrong with that, but for me it was something more, and I sort of realized this is not going to really go in the direction I had hoped. How many times am I going to get a chance to go out to California and write for TV? I know nothing about writing for TV. I'd never even written a spec script. What's the worst that can happen? I can go out there and fail miserably and come back here. And I came out on a Friday and I started work on a Monday, the following Monday.
And that was with Grace Under Fire.
It was Grace Under Fire, the second season of Grace Under Fire. Chuck Lorre had been replaced by a really lovely man named Mark Flanagan, who I saw lose like 50 pounds over the course of the season. And that was really trial by fire. In a lot of ways, that was the best first job I could ever have because nothing will ever be that bad. I got a real crash course in lack of respect for the text, how there's so much wasted time on sitcoms because jokes that really work on a Monday, at the Wednesday run through, the network executives say, "That joke's not working anymore." And it's like, well, it's because you know it. You haven't heard it. If you were hearing it for the first time, it would work. But so you have to change. You have to constantly change. It doesn't necessarily get better. It gets different. And also on that show, there was it was a very dysfunctional environment because of the star. She was she had a lot of problems, and she was. I don't think she was equipped to handle the pressure that came from being the star of a hit TV show.
Was she involved in the creative process as well?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. I was actually, that year we did a very special episode where Grace goes to Graceland. And I was the one who was sent to Memphis because nobody else would go. Because I was the lowest ranking guy, I had to go. That was a memorable trip.
So how did you handle the tensions on the set?
I wasn't happy, but there was nothing I could do about it. So I just became that mule that and just persevered and just kept going. And at the end of the season, I was informed I was not being asked back, which I was really upset for about a minute. And then I was told that I could go to Sybil, which had just done a half season, first season, and Chuck Lorre was running Sybil, and I went to Sybil and I worked there for 3 years.
And at what point in the show were you working on that? Was it from the beginning?
On Sybil?
Yes.
It was the second season.
Second
I worked
season.
second, third, and fourth and final season.
And what was the premise of that show?
It was basically Ab Fab in America with Sybil as Edwina and Christine Baranski as Patsy. It was about supposedly it was about what if Sybil Shepherd had never become a star, and she had just sort of struggled and was this B actress, although she lived in this amazing house in the Hollywood Hills, which I don't know how anybody could afford without becoming a star, but hey, that's TV. And she had 2 ex-husbands and 2 daughters.
And what was your role on the show when you started?
When I started, I was story editor or executive story editor, and I guess about 5 or 6 episodes in, then there was a big shake-up, and Chuck Lorre and Lee Aronson, and I think those were the only 2 were booted. The show was very successful, and at the time, and Christine Baranski was getting a lot of well-deserved attention, and I don't think Sybil could handle that. Pretty much every season, we would lose a showrunner, and those of us who stayed would get huge title bumps and pay raises. And so I worked my way up from staff writer to co-executive producer in like 3 years. And it was not because I was particularly great at what I did. It was because I was one of the people who stayed. And I was there through the bitter end of that show. Actually, after my second year on that show, I said to my agent, I really don't want to go back. I would rather just not work, and I'm going to write a screenplay. Because I somehow, on some level, I knew I was losing touch with what it was that made me want to be a writer in the first place. Because I was just involved in this factory work, and I was learning terms like the moment of shit, which is literally, we would start breaking an episode of what's the moment of shit. And that would be the moment where Sybil's daughter would come up and say, Mom, I guess the reason I was mad at you is because I'm jealous of you, because you're so together. And yeah, it was disgusting. And I was learning such horrible tricks and second guessing what the network would want, which was always make everybody nicer and spell out the subtext. And what the star would want, which was like make me look really smart and on top of everything, and make me look really clever with the least amount of effort on my part. And it was kind of soul-deadening for me in a way. And at the end of the second season, I said, I don't want to come back. I just want to go write the great American screenplay. I want to write something I care about, because I've spent 3 years of my life working these insane hours, 70, 80-hour work weeks, writing stuff that I would not even watch, And they offered me so much money that I said, wow, I can't believe anybody would ever pay me that much money. Okay, but I'm going to put it in the bank, and then I'm going to take a year off. But what happened was I felt like such a whore, because I was. I would come home at 3 a.m, and I would sit down and write, and that's what became American Beauty.
That's great.
I don't want to say, I am not in any way disparaging sitcoms or sitcom writing, because that is some of the hardest writing there is. And I worked with really, really smart, good people that I learned a lot from. In those 2 particular instances, I didn't feel like the shows were really about anything. And the work environments were so dysfunctional that I think I learned a lot about what I would never do if I had my own show, or what I would never allow to happen. And but I so value those years and those people that I worked with, because I feel like I really learned a lot, and it made me a better writer, even though I had to unlearn a lot of the tricks that I learned just to survive in those war zones, I like to call them.
Can you tell us a little bit about working with Chuck Lorre?
I didn't really get to work with Chuck Lorre that much. I mean, I owe my career to him, but by the time I got on Grace Under Fire, he was gone, and 6 or 7 episodes into my first season of Sybil, he left. So I admire Chuck tremendously. I think he's a really, really smart guy and a good guy. But I didn't really get to work with him that much. So what little amount of time I had, I really enjoyed.
And you touched on the atmosphere on the set. Could you tell us a little bit more about that, and maybe about the tensions between Sybil and Christine?
Well, here's the thing. I think in both Brett and Sybil's cases, they're not actors. They are performers. They, Brett was a stand-up, and Sybil was a very beautiful girl who was perfectly cast in a couple of movies. But in terms of technique and in terms of distancing themselves from the characters they're playing, they didn't have that. So what you would get is a lot of, well, I would never do that. I would know that Zoe was lying to me and sneaking out to go with the boyfriend, and I would stop it. And you're like, okay, so you're perfect, so we have to build some comedy out of how perfect you are. And in both instances, I think they knew deep down that they weren't actors. But rather than embracing this situation where I get to do this and be surrounded by all these people who really are good at what they do and it all makes me look good, I'm playing armchair psychologist here. I just don't think they could ever get past the fact that at the center of themselves, they felt like they didn't deserve it, which is tragic, but it's also a huge pain in the ass when you're writing something for actors and they, and the people you're writing for, their emotional problems create so much strife. It was really hard, and I got very resentful. American Beauty is an angry screenplay, and that's where a lot of that came from, because I felt, here's this thing, this gift that I have, supposedly, that I've always had this sort of respect, and there's been a purity of intent, because it wasn't about making money, it wasn't about anything, it was just out of the sheer love of it. And here I'm having to use it and do it in this way that feels so disgusting and icky, and I have no respect for these women, none. It was just really, really tough.
It was a very subversive show in terms of feminism. Was that intentional? How did that sort of come about?
Sybil?
Yeah.
Well, I think Sybil wanted it to be do you really think it was subversive?
It tried.
Yeah, exactly. I think, a lot of that was her. She wanted to, but I mean, it's a double-edged sword. I mean, she was doing a scene where she was talking with a talk show host, and she was like, come on, let's take our makeup off. And yet there's no way she would ever be photographed without makeup. So it was all making her look good. Part of what bugged me so much about that show and about Grace Under Fire is both of those women looked at the show as sort of PR for their lives and how they wanted the world to perceive them. And for me, that's just that is not the reason to do something, I mean, I appreciated that aspect of it, but then there were also, yeah, at least I wasn't working on, stupid frat boys, like, I wasn't working on the stupid frat boy show, but.
Did you ever face any censorship issues on Sybil?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, we did a really, really, really funny episode. It was a Valentine's Day episode, and it was about how the heart is actually a symbol of labia. And if you turn it upside down, and we did this, it was hilarious, and we were not allowed to say labia because I guess CBS felt it was too offensive. And although people said penis all the time, which I really thought, well, that's bullshit, and we had to cut some really, really funny stuff just because it wasn't, at the time, it wasn't appropriate for CBS. Later, when I created my own show for ABC, which kind of was the stupid frat boy show, I had to fight to allow a character to say G-spot. And on Grace Under Fire, we did a story about a chiropractor, and Grace fell on some ice, and she went to a chiropractor, and we were not allowed to say that what he did worked in any way, which I think had more to do with advertiser craziness.
Are there any episodes of Sybil that stand out for you that you enjoyed, that you liked?
I always loved that one. I wrote an episode called Three Women and a Dummy that was about Zoe's prom night and Sybil and the waiter that at the restaurant where they worked at. Somehow she ended up getting him to come out to his parents or something. What else? Those are the two that stick out to me.
And can you tell us a little bit about Carsey Werner's working there and their process?
They always said, we're the writers' company. And I thought, yeah, you're the company built on the bones of dead writers. Because they basically, would create these monsters with Sybil and Roseanne and Brett. And they would just, writers were just grist for the mill. I wasn't crazy about them and the time that I spent there. I mean, I'm grateful for the work, but I didn't feel like they stuck up for the writers one bit. And I remember doing a run through of Grace Under Fire, and it was a scene in bleachers. And so it was a run-through, so we just had our 4 regulars, because you're going to bring in the extras on show night, but you're not going to hire them for a run-through. I mean, even I knew that, and I was a staff writer. And Tom Werner came to the run-through and he said, isn't it weird that they're all sitting, that they're just sitting in the stands by themselves? Wouldn't there be other people? And we were all just like, wow, yes, there will be other people. And so I did feel like there was a little bit of a disconnect between the powers that be and the actual process of how television is made. I'm going to get in so much trouble for this.
And then you stayed with Sybil till the bitter end, and then American Beauty.
Yes.
So you worked on American Beauty while... So in 1999, American Beauty came out.
Mm-hmm.
How did you come up with the idea for that film?
I had actually been working on the basic premise and story of that movie for 8 years. The genesis of the idea for me was the Amy Fisher, Joey Buttafuoco business in New York City. When I was living there, I was working at Adweek, and I came out one day and some guy was selling a comic book about Amy and Joey. And on one side was this virginal-looking Amy and a big, leering, lecherous, predatory Joey. You flip it over, and then he's all buttoned up and looks like a good husband, and she's all tarted up and predatory, slutty vixen. And I remember thinking, the truth is somewhere in between those, and we will never know what it is. And that's somehow I started thinking about these characters and this murder and how it all played itself out. And then years later, I had switched agencies, and I met with my features agent, Andrew Canava, who was still my agent. And I said, I've got this screenplay that I wrote, adaptation of my Bridesmaid play. He said, yeah, but everybody's read that and nothing ever happened with it. I need a new script from you. I need to reintroduce you to the features community. I said, okay, well, here are these ideas I have. I pitched 2 pretty stock romantic comedies, and then I pitched American Beauty, which is kind of hard to pitch because it's not a high concept. And I was telling him there's this guy next door, and he's got a video camera, and he said, that's the one you should write. And I said, really? I'm surprised. Why? And he said, because that's obviously the one that you're passionate about. And it's the best piece of advice I ever got. And so I wrote it, and I gave it to him, and he was so smart. He said, he started talking about the script to people and saying, I have this amazing script, and they'd say, can I read it? And he'd say, no, you're not on the list. So he created this level of expectation about it. And then when it went out, it was, it sold pretty quickly. And I was still working at Civil when the screenplay sold. And a week prior to that, I signed a 3-year TV development deal with Bob Greenblatt and David Janelari. So it was a moment where a lot happened for me.
Did you draw from any of your own personal experiences to write the script for
American Beauty? Well, obviously, just the sense of having been, I was Lester's age at the time, and I drew from the sense of having lost my passion and needing to get that passion back. I certainly drew on my experience at Adweek in terms of depicting his work environment. Aside from that, no.
And how did your television experience influence how you approached this script?
Well, what it did is after all those years of the moment of shit, I was like, I don't have to have a moment of shit, People can behave really badly. We can still see the pain in them that's causing them to behave that way, but not everybody has to be nice. I think I was rebelling against the constraints that I felt writing for network TV sitcoms.
Did you see film as a higher art form?
No. And I still don't. I think in a lot of ways, at this point in time right now, for a writer, television is a much more attractive medium than movies. There's much more freedom in the types of stories you can tell, the amount of time you can take to tell the story. But American Beauty was a movie. It wasn't a TV show. I wasn't thinking of, and I guess at the time I was so sick of TV, even though I had signed a TV development deal and I went on to develop my own sitcom. I think it was something about writing in the different medium. You know what I mean? Not having to, every third line had to be a punchline, and the freedom of getting out of those constraints was kind of liberating as a writer. I still feel that way about writing in different mediums. I wrote a play 4 years ago, which the critics loathed and reviled, but it was a great experience for me to get back into a medium that's all about the language, and it's a different kind of storytelling in a different rhythm. And I still love hopping around between the three mediums. I'd like to write a novel someday but I'm scared of that. I don't think it'd be any good.
With the same year American Beauty came out, you returned to TV on Oh, Grow Up.
Yes.
And so what was your role on that series?
I created it, and I was the executive producer. It was loosely based on a one-act play I had written called Bachelor Holiday. And that was all based on my experience living in this Brooklyn brownstone with 3 other guys.
What were you trying to say on that show?
I was trying to do something kind of subversive and fun along the lines of The Young Ones from the BBC. I think by the time the show got on the air, I had gone through this development process. And I think I just took everybody's notes because at that point, I thought that's what you're supposed to do. Everything they tell you to do, you have to do it. So I did it. And the show turned into sort of like a Friends-ish show about really attractive people making wisecracks. But by the time, it was picked up and it went to air, and by the time we were in production, I was just, I was really working very hard to make that show go. I was very aware of the fact that the show was employing, 150, 200 people. I loved the writers I was working with. I loved the actors. I felt like it, obviously I believed in it or I wouldn't have done it. But it just wasn't meant to be. And it was at the time when ABC was so addicted to Who Wants to Be a Millionaire that we just didn't make it past the first. They didn't even show all the original 13 episodes. I think they only showed 12. It was heartbreaking. It was heartbreaking for me because I think the cognitive dissonance of talking myself into believing in this show so much. Then when the show ended, it triggered a lot of post-traumatic shit that I have about death and abrupt endings, and I kind of went into a little tailspin, depression. Right at the time American Beauty was getting all this acclaim and I was winning Oscars and I was going, it was a very, very insane time in my life. But it taught me a lot about balance because I remember there was a People magazine, The Best and Worst of 1999, and it said the best movies in American Beauty was on this page, and you turned it, and literally on the other page it said the worst TV shows. and Oh Grow Up was one of them. It made me a lot more thick-skinned, and it fueled 6 Feet Under, because I had been pitched the idea of a show set in a family-run funeral home by Carolyn Strauss of HBO. After American Beauty came out, I was working on Oh Grow Up at the time, so I was unavailable, and I said, that really sounds like a great idea, and I would love to work on it, but unfortunately I'm unavailable. Best of luck with that. And then when Oh Grow Up got canceled, I had 2 years left on my TV deal. I wasn't about to say, well, I'm not going to do it because now I'm this big movie guy. I just won an Oscar, because I felt like, well, that's really zero integrity. I signed this deal and I cashed your check, so of course I'm gonna, continue to develop shows. But people were calling me saying, we have this hacky stand-up comedian we'd love to build a show around, or we have this washed-up movie actor who wants to do TV, or the president of this network has an idea about a man who's reincarnated as his wife's dog, and you're the perfect person to do all this. I was like, oh, Jesus, I cannot go back into that gulag. So I went home for Christmas, I think it was 1999, and I wrote the pilot to 6 Feet Under, knowing that HBO wanted a show about a family-run funeral home, having, become a huge fan of The Sopranos, and having been sort of reinvigorated about what was possible for television. And I got back and I gave it to my agent, Sue Nagel, who now is the head of original programming at HBO, and said, what do you think of this? Let's give it to HBO. And we did, and they liked it, and they gave me some notes, and I did another pass, and they said, let's do it. Let's do the pilot.
Excellent.
It was charmed. It was as equally charmed an experience as American Beauty was, I think. Actually, I remember going in and I did a lot of things in the original pilot. I set up the fact that the two brothers had been left the funeral home and all this stuff, and their notes were, it feels a little safe, feels a little networky. Can you just make the whole thing a little more fucked up? And I said, yeah, absolutely. And not that I did that gratuitously, but then that just gave me the freedom to avoid the moments of shit, to avoid having to make everybody articulate the subtext, to avoid making everybody nice all the time. And that was really, really liberating.
So let's start at the beginning of 6 Feet Under. Where and when was it set? Where and when was it set?
Where was it set?
Yeah.
It was set in Los Angeles. Yeah, and it was set in the present day. So that was 1990. I think we did the pilot in 2000. So.
Why did you choose to put it in LA?
Because LA seems to be like the world capital of denial of mortality. Just in terms of, youth is so worshipped and everybody tries to be so young, and just plastic surgery and the movie business, and it just didn't seem like I liked the juxtaposition of that, because it seems like the last place in the world you would set a show about death.
And as you were creating it, did you pull anything from your own life?
Oh yeah, I pulled a lot more from my own life for 6 Feet Under than I did for American Beauty. Yeah, in the pilot there are things that I witnessed. When my sister died and my mom went to the casket, she broke down. She was so emotional, and the funeral directors came and took her behind this curtain. The subtext being, that kind of emotion's not pretty. We shouldn't see that. And then I had gone to Europe when I was 19, and we had been on this boat going from Sicily to this island. I wish I could remember the name of it. It's a volcanic island, and on the boat was a casket. And when they brought the casket ashore, all these women swathed in black threw themselves on the casket and started wailing and beating their chests. And I remember I had never seen any expression of grief like that, which is way healthier than, like the repressed, waspy way of doing things. And so that went in there. I would say that certain characteristics of myself and maybe some family members ended up in there, but I won't name names. Yeah, that was a lot more autobiographical. Well, I'd had a lot of experiences with death growing up, and I went through a period where people were dropping like flies, and I was pallbearer at my grandfather's funeral, and this person was dead. My sister died. It really, I spent a lot of time in funeral homes at a very impressionable point in my life. So that experience, that feeling, that sort of surreal quality stuck with me. And that's why when Carolyn had pitched the idea of 6 Feet Under to me, something in my head just went click. I get it. I see that show.
And do you think that's why so many of your subjects touch on mortality and death? And
Probably. I mean, when you're 13 years old and one of the persons who means the most to you in your life dies in front of you, it's pretty hard to ignore death after that. It becomes a constant companion. Not constant, but it's there. It's just a reality. It's just in your life. You really get the fact that, yes, one day I will die. Everyone I love is going to die. That's just life. So I think it's hard for me to ignore that in my worldview, and so of course that's going to end up in my work.
So describe for us the premise of the show.
6 Feet Under is about a family-run funeral home in Los Angeles, and the lives of the people of the family and the people who work for them over a period of 5 years at the very beginning of the 21st century.
And can you tell us about the genesis of the title itself?
Originally I had called it Afterlife, which 2 words, but then I found out there was a Japanese movie with that title. So I just thought 6 Feet Under, because it's a euphemism for being dead and buried. And so much of the show is not just about mortality, but about how we press our emotions down and we keep them hidden and we're afraid of them. And so it seemed like it did double duty, both as a euphemism for being dead and the idea of buried, keeping things buried. Everything's buried.
Now, HBO obviously was okay with the idea of a funeral home, a show
Yes.
set in a funeral home. Were there any topics that were taboo or anything you couldn't cover?
The one topic I always said in the writer's room, I just don't want to go there because it doesn't serve anything, is necrophilia. But everything else was wide open. I mean, and part of what interested me about these people is if you live in such constant proximity to death, if you are the people that the rest of us hire to face death for you, how does that affect your life? How does that affect your worldview? But the HBO was, I remember at one point there was a little bit of an issue with, it was in the very last season after Nate had died and Brenda had found out he had been unfaithful, and she lost patience with Maya, and she sort of shook her and yelled at her. And both Carolyn Strauss and another executive over there had recently become mothers, and they were like, we don't want Brenda to be a bad mother. And I was like, of course she's going to be a bad mother. Look at what just happened to her. People are bad mothers. Even the best mothers are bad mothers 1 or 2 moments. And she realizes it, and so we kept it.
Was it difficult to come up with new ways for people to die every week?
At the beginning? Well, we went through a phase of where we would come up with creative ways for people to die, and then we went through a phase of trying to mislead the audience, you think it's going to happen this way, but it's going to happen this way to this person over here. And eventually, we had a bank. People would come in with newspaper clippings about this person. Look, this guy in Arkansas died in this hilarious way. So we had by the end of it, we had a bank of crazy cinematic ways for people to die.
Did you do a lot of research and visit people in the profession? And
I read some books. I read The American Way of Death by Jessica Mitford, which is a sort of screed against the death industry, condemning it for trying to be profitable in one way. The death industry is weird. It's weird. But at the same time, I don't think what are you going to do? We're not going to keep the body in our house like we used to. We're not going to bathe our dead family members like we used to, although maybe that might be more healthy. And and it's just, it is what it is, and there are people who work in that industry who genuinely want to help people. And so I felt like Jessica Mitford's book was interesting to me on a lot of fronts, but in the same way I was like, I don't want to write a show. I got to love these people. I can't like beat them up for, wanting to sell the most expensive casket. And then I read a series of books by Thomas Lynch, who is an undertaker and a poet, one of which was called The Undertaking. And those books were the most influential, because they really did sort of do such a great job of articulating that sort of half world between life and death and the space in which those people live. And there was a beautiful, beautiful essay about him and his brother washing their father's dead body. And I started to see the poetry in it and the beauty. And I felt like that's where I wanted to go with the show, as opposed to, look at this awful industry that wants to be profitable. How could they? How dare they? In terms of like going to funeral homes and going into actual prep rooms and watching an embalming, no, I did not want to do that. But my art director did go and, did a lot of art direction research, but I did not feel it was necessary for me to write the show.
Can you talk a little bit about the sexuality on the series, why you chose to approach homosexuality with David the way you did?
Well, I'm gay. So obviously the story of a guy who is, the most important person that you come out to is yourself. And so obviously, I don't sit down and make decisions about who this person is and what was going to, it's a much more organic process. But I guess on subconscious level, I felt like that's a good story to tell. Because being a gay man and watching the depictions of gay characters on TV, they, when I was very young, they were criminals and psychopaths. Then they became victims, with the AIDS epidemic, and they were tragic, suffering victims. And then they became wisecracking guys, but they never had sex. I rember there was a soap opera I watched, As the World Turns, and they had this gay character. And then during the summer, they would all go to the yacht club, and all the guys would take off their shirts. It was a soap opera. But he wouldn't. He would leave his shirt on. I think it was like, well, we can't really say that he's a sexual being. He's like, it was very sort of condescending and token. Here's the token gay. And being on HBO, I thought, well, that's an interesting story. To see how that internalized homophobia that you cannot escape if you grow up in the world, how it's going to play itself out in, dangerous behavior and risk-taking, and what are the hurdles this guy has to get over before he can just be comfortable being himself and being in a relationship with another man. That being said, I identified with all three of those kids. Claire, I was the youngest kid. I was the one who had artistic aspirations. I was the one who looked around at the members of my family and went, who are these freaks? How did I end up here? And then like Nate, I'm a Peter Pan. It took me a long time to sort of grow up. So I think one of the great things about HBO is that you don't have to shy away from the sexuality. I'm not necessarily interested in sex just for the sake of sex, but certainly a character's sexuality is going to shed a lot of light on who they are and what they are. And in a show about death, death and sex are almost like two different sides. Sex is creation, life, and death is the end. So of course it's going to need to be in there.
And it also deals a lot with religion and morality. So did your own beliefs play into that as you were creating it?
I try really hard not to. I'm interested in raising questions. I'm not interested in sort of saying, here's the answer, because I feel like everybody's got to find their own answer, and there's no one answer that's right for every single person. I think it's a very limited way of thinking. My religious, spiritual views lean more towards Buddhism, And I'm sure that kind of came across in the show in ways. I know we did have a Buddhist funeral, but we tried to do as many different funerals and as many different ways of seeing death through as many different spiritual, philosophical refractors as possible. The one thing I think that we did always try to do is never come down firmly on the idea of life after death, because no one knows. And to say that whenever a dead person appeared, it was that person's memory, or the person who sees them, it was their projection of their own internal stuff. They weren't ghosts. Although I'm sure some people saw them as ghosts. But of course, death is, I wonder if we weren't mortal, would we even have religion? Would we even have a need for it? You know what I mean? So, of course, religion's going to be a big part of the show, too.
Can you talk a little bit about filming the pilot, maybe some of the challenges you faced on the pilot?
Well, I directed the pilot, and I was, I remember HBO said, who do you want to direct the pilot? And I was like, me. I'd like to direct it. Fully expecting them to go, yes, I'm sure you would, but seriously, you've never directed anything before and you don't know what you're doing. But they said yes. Only later did I find out they were thinking, oh my God, what the hell are we going to do with this kid? But I know David Chase directed the pilot of The Sopranos, and I thought, well, why not? I had spent the entire shoot of American Beauty on set watching. I have to admit, those first few days it was a little scary, but I had a very clear idea of what I wanted to, I had a very clear idea visually of how the story should be told. I had a great cinematographer, Alan Queso, and I just did it, It was very fast, but I remember being very pleased with it. I was a little terrified of the bus crash, but there were people who really knew what they were doing and how to choreograph that, and I thought that all worked really well. I was very happy with it, and once we cut it together, I felt like this works. It works.
And can you talk a little bit about the opening credits sequence and the theme song?
Once we decided, once we got the go-ahead that we were going to series, and we would need a title sequence, I turned to Tom Newman, whom I love, and who had scored American Beauty. I said, would you write a theme song for this? And I showed him the pilot, the rough cut of the pilot, and he wrote the music. And I loved it. And then we had a bunch of title company designers come in and with storyboards, and they'd pitch what they want to do. I knew the one thing I didn't want to do is I didn't want to have actors' faces, because those things are always embarrassing, when people are like, right as their name appears. So this company, Digital Kitchen, came in and they just pitched this series of these really beautiful images, and it was like, yeah, absolutely. And we gave it to them, and they went off and filmed it, and they brought it back, and we adjusted and made some notes. But I feel like the title sequence for both 6 Feet Under and both True Blood serves a dual purpose. It gets all the information out there of who worked on everything, but it also takes you into the world of the show. It's 90 seconds that pulls you into this world that is very different from the world we live in. In the one case, it's a world where death is present and there's this sort of padding around everything and the feelings are all buried. And the other one is this primal, crazy swamp where supernatural creatures try to, have their way and with humans and assimilate into society and all that weirdness. And I feel like it's the same company, Digital Kitchen did both, and I really, really love the work that they do, because I feel like both those title sequences help make the experience of the show what it is.
So now the show goes to series.
Yes.
As the showrunner, how do you ensure that you don't have similar experiences to your previous TV shows on this set?
You hire actors You hire people who can tell the difference between themselves and the characters they're playing. You hire people who have been trained, who have stage experience, who are not, just personalities. You make sure that everybody, no matter what their job, is treated with respect, and you just make sure that it's. I mean, this may sound hokey, but I feel so grateful to get to make a living doing this. I think to approach it with anything other than that gratitude is kind of obnoxious. I've worked around so many people who just make the experience miserable, and they create all this drama, and it never, ever helps. And it's a hard job. Everybody has a hard job to do on a TV show or a movie. And I think what I thought is I'm not gonna have a set where people are treated badly, where there's a lack of respect for anybody's job, where the text is basically considered where the scripts are considered something that can be tossed and rewritten at the last minute based on the whim of this person or that person. And we're going to tell a really interesting story, and everybody's going to have a good time telling it.
And so let's talk a little bit about the writing process on the show. What's the process you go through?
The process that I've sort of developed on 6 Feet Under. And when I first was staffing, I hired some people based on some spec scripts for other shows they had written. Somebody wrote a great Sopranos. Somebody wrote a great The Practice. And over the course of the first couple of years, I realized just because you can nail the voice of The Sopranos doesn't mean you can nail the voice of this show. So I instituted after that, I would only read original work. I would only read original pilots or original screenplays. I've even read short stories. I hired somebody off a short story because I felt like I need to know that a person's voice, their organic voice, is similar to the voice of the show. And then my writer's room is very democratic. I'm not one of those people who has to write every single word himself. I don't want to work that hard. I don't want to have to, I don't want to have to depend on pharmaceuticals. That's maybe I'm just justifying my own laziness, but I just don't think that's necessary. I want to have a life. After all those years on sitcoms, I don't want to have to work on the weekends. I don't want to have to work until 1 a.m. And it's not necessary. It's not necessary. So I ended up with a group of writers, all of whom had sort of the same general voice. And what we do is we break stories as a group. We outline as a group. The writer of that episode will go off and write a first draft. We give notes on that draft as a group, which I think is really helpful because, I'm not a woman, so maybe, the women writers would have a perspective about something that the rest of us guys in the room would not have. So it's really helpful, and then that second draft comes in and I would do a pass on it. I do a pass on it before it goes to HBO. And HBO gives their notes, and either I or the writer will address those notes. And then that writer serves as the on-set producer for the episode, from prep through shooting through post. Because otherwise I would have to work 70, 80-hour weeks. And I think there's also something good about that because it gives people a real sense of ownership of their episode. It teaches them valuable skills that they'll need. But when you really respect people and you respect the work that they do and you sort of tell them, what do you think? What do you think is the best thing to do here? And you empower them, they do a better job. They're more invested. They're more committed. And the icing on the cake is that I don't have to work so hard.
Excellent. Let's stop there to change tape.
Okay.